Hello, everyone. My name is Astrid Edwards. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I am the host of two book podcasts, The Garrett Writers on Writing and Anonymous Was a Woman. And because of that, I have the great pleasure of talking to Jennifer Mills all the way from Italy today. Jennifer, how are you?
Hi, Astrid. Thank you so much for the invitation to speak with you. I'm pretty well, actually, all things considered.
So before we get started, and I have so many questions for you, for those who are listening, you are able to ask Jennifer any questions that you like. So you do that through the Slido function on the State Library Victoria's website, and you need a code, and the code is #52971. That was #52971, and that means that you can ask Jen any questions that you like. So Jen, firstly, once again, thank you so much for joining us in Italy. It's about 7 a.m. for you, isn't it?
Yeah.
Now, to kick us off, how did you find yourself in Italy?
My partner took a job here for a couple of years. She's a teacher. So we moved over here in August at the start of the school year. And now she's teaching from home.
I bet she's teaching from... I bet
she's teaching development.
Now, I am in this series with the State Library, I am chatting to writers about what they think of the world right now, how they're interacting with the world right now, because everything has changed in ways that we could not anticipate and did not expect. I am a fan of your writing. Now, you are a poet, you write short fiction, but you also write novels. Dyschronia was one of my favorite novels of last year, actually, and nonfiction, and you were the former fiction editor of Overland. So you come at the world both from that creative ideas perspective, and you do write, near-term future scenarios of where we might all be, but you also engage in a lot of nonfiction. And I've actually read two pieces that you published recently in the Sydney Review of Books and in Overland, where you are essentially commenting on the bushfires that we've experienced recently and COVID-19. So I guess I'd like to kick off and ask, what have you felt like as a writer experiencing these things? What did you want to put into words and help us all see?
Well, I think in the beginning, at least, when the situation in Italy was very frightening and catastrophic, it is catastrophic, but when it seemed like we didn't know what was going to happen next, I think part of my role felt like to spread the warning to other countries. I felt like I was shouting at Australia through a pane of soundproof glass at some points, because the only way that we could find to stop the spread of this illness that was killing people was to go into lockdown. And I could see the rest of the world not taking that decision seriously, like the delays in the UK that we're now seeing have had an effect. So I think that immediate motivation to share information and to get the message across felt really important. But now, as we're sort of coming out the other side of lockdown, I think my role is shifting a little to something more, maybe more reflective. And I think rather than the shape has changed somehow, like instead of pushing this message out, I feel like I'm trying to contain the story somehow, which is a much more complicated task.
What do you mean by contain the story?
Well, I think, you look at the social effects of something like this that are global, but they're also really personal. And as a novelist, I think one of our skill sets is being able to zoom in and out on that sort of scale, to look at big social shifts through individual experiences, or to look at the individual effect on society as well. And I've always felt like that's part of the job. And so I think, as we sort of process this crisis, it's important to look at how it's affecting individuals, but also like how these changes are playing out. And there's an infinite number of takes on the internet already, and every possible perspective will be spoken. But I think that fiction has a special way of integrating this kind of information in a way that incorporates the uncertainty that is a big part of it.
Are you working on a large fiction piece right now?
I am. I've actually got 2 books going, which has been my salvation in lockdown because I've had heaps of work to do. So the main thing that I'm doing now is editing a book that will be coming out next year called The Airways, which is a ghost story that I've been working on for a few years now, which I'm really excited about. And the pandemic has inflected it in really interesting ways, as well as sort of little mirrors in there that I didn't see before in the editing process. And the other book I'm working on is just in the beginning stages, and it's probably going to be more influenced by what's happening, but I'm not sure how. It was already a book that was about crisis and care work, so I think it will be very interesting to see where that one goes.
Crisis in care work, we are watching that play out around the world in so many different ways. Before we explore your fiction a little bit further, can I just take a step back, because you are in Italy, and it's northern Italy, is that correct?
Yeah, I'm in Torino.
So you've just experienced something that is very different than the Australian COVID-19 experience and how things are playing out here. Can you just describe what you know, as an Australian national in Italy, have experienced for the last couple of months?
Well, it's funny because you're experiencing it, but you're also still quite remote from it. We're isolated in our homes. We see our neighbours across the street, but we don't know them. We chat with our neighbours in the building at a distance. And you sort of, I don't know, I feel more connected to friends and family in Australia in some ways because I'm on Zoom chats with them more often than I was before.
Zoom is our saviour.
Yeah, well, you know, I often let these kind of social interactions slide, and now I'm prioritizing it, so that's been nice. But I think the experience of the sort of fear and anxiety in the streets at the beginning was really palpable and really frightening. Just by coincidence, my partner was in hospital in February and got out just before the first case was found in Milan, and so she went back for a checkup on the day that they were putting the triage tents into the emergency wards. And so we were watching out the window from the waiting room as that was happening, and the Civil Protection Authority was there. But even then it was, you know, 2 people had died, or there were 10 infections, and we weren't taking it super seriously. We were sort of like, oh, well, it won't be a problem here, it's just Milan. And that the speed and the inexorability with which it hit, it really shocked the whole country. Yeah, and I think also having had that experience of the Italian public health system, which we do fortunately have access to here, having seen how hard people work and in what conditions, you know, they are some of the best hospitals in the world, but they've also been under 10 years of austerity measures because of EU policies largely. And they need more resources, they need more workers, they need more equipment, you know, and like all hospitals all around the world, that, you know, there's never enough. But having sort of had that encounter with the system, I think it does feel like we just sort of glanced out of the way of the virus in a way.
Absolutely. Can you reflect on your experience, you know, watching this play out in, you know, physical proximity to you, and then compare it with what you are seeing in Australia?
Yeah, so I guess the crisis is much more visible here as a part of daily life, in that there's a lot of sirens. It's sort of affecting people that we know, like people's elderly relatives or people's friends. And, you know, now I'm seeing colleagues in New York who are ill as well. And so that's sort of a big deal. I think Australia has, like, the population and the public health system have done really well in getting information out and in acting quickly. I think now it's really interesting to see this discourse of, well, let's open up and murder people for the economy. And it's really interesting to see who pops out with this opinion that anyone over 70 or anyone with a disability or chronic illness is okay to to kill for the economy. And it's an absolutely false dichotomy. Illness is not good for the economy in any stretch. It's expensive. You lose human beings. But even just the moral emptiness at the heart of capitalism is so visible. And it was always there, but it's just like, wow, people are actually saying this out loud. That's their opinion.
Jen, thank you for saying that. I have parents who are, over 70, and I am a person with a disability. I live with a compromised immune system, and to watch that debate in public, basically saying it's okay if people like me and people in my family, aren't as important, is shocking. And that's one of the reasons why I love writers so much, because writers can articulate these bigger things, so we all engage with the questions and the complexities and the things that are hard. There are so many crises in the world at the moment, but I want to really zero in on your experience of this one at the moment. Can you tell me about like the practicalities of your day, like food and internet, but also, you are a creative. What's it like to be locked at home and to try to produce work, to have imagination, to see the future?
Well, yeah, the imaginative part of it is more difficult. I think the editing's been better because it's more cerebral. But it's also been kind of a salvation to have work that takes me out of the room and into my head a little bit, that I can sort of separate myself a little. The logistics, like we have really good internet access here, but and technology to use it, and we're really fortunate that we can both still be working. But the logistics of sharing a workspace with a primary school teacher that is like a 1-bedroom apartment where my office is in the hallway is really been super challenging, and funny in a way. We sort of end up collaborating with each other in these really unexpected ways. Like I've been sort of waving at the kids on screen, and sometimes I'll just like participate, help make a diorama or something. And it's actually been really, really nice to have a primary school going on in the other room. But it's, yeah, the focus concentration stuff has really changed.
Yeah, absolutely. So
thank goodness for white noise apps.
I think a lot of people are using those these days. My partner certainly does, probably to drown me out. So, I want to go back to your creativity at the moment. I mean, not great working conditions. You wouldn't have, set yourself up that way for this year, if it wasn't for a global pandemic. But when you are sitting down working on 2 pieces of creative work, and particularly the new story or the new idea that you have bubbling around, you're obviously trying to create your own world and story, but what type of thing do you think what type of art will come out of this pandemic and this global crisis? And I don't mean the first book that is called Pandemic and, is probably written terribly. I mean the real art and the real stories.
Yeah, look, I think as much as possible is my best answer. All of the variety of work is necessary, and the economic difficulties that artists and writers are facing now are going to be really challenging in the years ahead, especially the next 12 months. A shout out to the artists who made the work behind me, Josh Santaspirito, Leon Fernandez. Like, please, if you can afford it, buy paintings off Instagram, like support artists in whatever way you can through this, because the government doesn't give a shit. But, I think the more the merrier at this point, the more work that we can get out. I think of the AIDS crisis a lot at the moment, which is something that was around when I was growing up, and the flourishing of documentation, of passion, of art that came out of that, but that was also crushed by that, just the sheer scale of loss and death and all of the work that could have been made by the artists that died. I feel like, for my generation, there's a bit of a responsibility to keep going and keep pushing for those people. And in the same way, I feel like in any crisis, like those of us who can do the work of sharing this experience and looking after each other and telling the stories, we need to do that. I
want to go back to the word you just used, responsibility. I have heard some writers echo your sentiments and say they do feel a responsibility to witness and to catalogue and to share and to explain. And I've heard others say, no, it's not my responsibility. I will be influenced by this in the future, but it's not my responsibility now. And I think both are completely legitimate. But I'm interested in teasing this idea out further with you, the idea of responsibility and what art has witnessed forever, you know, including in our own lifetimes, and how that's brought to the, you know, broader public.
I went to see Amitav Ghosh speak last year here.
I love his book, The Great Derangement. Oh my goodness.
Yes, me too. And he was talking about Gun Island, his new novel, but he was asked how we need to shift the discourse in order to think about this moment of the Anthropocene and dealing with the climate emergency. And he said something that has really stuck with me, which was that we need to reconfigure our sense of ourselves, not as our rights or what we want, but as our duties of what we can offer, what we can do. And I think, you know, growing up Catholic, that's something that has probably stayed with me as well from my childhood, is this feeling of like social responsibility of, well, what do I have to give, to sacrifice, you know? And it's not everybody feels that way about their work, and that's fair. But for me, I think I feel my work as part of like a social labor, you know. And I don't want to sound egotistical about it, because I actually think that work is like, the more people that are doing that work, the better. It makes me less special as an individual, but I think that that feeling of like the long-term kind of historical record, well, that's something that I can do. And the thing that has kept me sane in this crisis is finding things that I can do to help. Whether it's writing things that share information with other people, whether it's trying to tell the story and help people process the emotional stuff that's going on, whether it's simply just saying, hey, you're okay, you don't have to be super productive in this time, have a break, to a friend of mine, like, and supporting people with mental health issues through this. I think it's really like, it's shifted that sense of like what a human being is for. And ultimately we're for each other, aren't we? Like, we're all alive together.
And we need to be doing a better job of looking after each other. Jen,
absolutely.
You almost brought tears to my eyes then, so this might be a really rambly question, but you know, this context is taking place, you know, with me knowing full well you're in Italy and all of us experiencing COVID-19 in very, very different ways in our lives, in our homes, wherever we're holed up. But we've also just experienced the worst bushfires that Australia has experienced for quite a while. And I know that, you know, you are a volunteer firefighter, and, you know, going from one crisis to another, what was it like for you to witness Australia experiencing those fires just a few months ago, when you have that personal experience of being a firefighter?
It's very frightening. I think the scale of those fires was really terrifying, and a part of me was just so glad to be the hell away from that. I also think that nobody's had time to recover from it yet. That threat to personal life and all of those communities that have suffered and people who've lost their homes, like, no one's had the chance to have a breath and a cup of tea and talk that over and process it, you know. And that's the interesting thing that's happening now, is that with the climate crisis sort of compressing these emergencies together, is we have less time to mourn and less time to process, and we have to do everything on the fly, which means that we have to adjust what we see as action in a crisis to include that element of care and processing trauma and telling the story. We have to do it all now at the same time, because there's never going to be an after where we have a moment anymore. There's never going to be a normal time where we can talk it through. We have to talk it through while it's happening. And that's a big challenge, but I don't think that we're incapable of it as human beings, I think.
We're not incapable. You just reminded me, I recently saw Bill Gates refer to pandemic too. And I have to say that terrified me no end. And it speaks to your idea that they will just keep coming, and we have to learn to talk about them and mourn them and understand them as they're happening.
And also not to live in fear of the next thing, but to accept that this is what life is now. Like, there's a lot of people that during the bushfire, the thing that got me was that discourse of like, oh, we can't talk about climate change during an emergency. We just have to deal with the emergency. And actually talking about the cause of the emergency is dealing with the emergency. Like, we're never going to deal with any of the emergencies if we wait until the emergencies are over. That's not going to happen. Well, so there's this very stealthy kind of way of silencing people.
Absolutely. I mean, climate change is not going to be over in our lifetime. It's a long-term thing. Jen, no, I went through your Twitter feed and you sent a tweet that gave me a lot of food for thought. And you were talking about how we interact with the world, and you described creatives and specifically filmmakers, authors, and artists, like the artist behind you, as the keepers of social memory. That's a beautiful phrase, the keepers of social memory. Can you talk me through that?
The thing that I was referring to was that there's been a call out here in Italy for a day of a public holiday for healthcare workers on February the 20th next year, and there was a petition going around, and the petition was started by a filmmaker and the Society of Authors and a bunch of writers and artists. And it was really interesting to me that these were the people in Italy who were stepping up and saying, how do we remember? How are we going to tell this story to our children? You know, that was literally how they were framing it. And I think it says a lot about a society that these are the people that are stepping up and saying we need to commemorate in order to prevent the same fragility in the healthcare system from happening again, in order to show people the value of the workers who are doing this. So I think that's, you know, it comes back to that idea of duty and of doing sort of, you know, whatever work it is that you do, doing it with that kind of care in mind. And it doesn't matter, like, we don't all have to be writers and artists. Nurses and doctors are much more important now. People who work in the supermarket are absolutely fucking vital. Thank goodness we've finally realized this. Let's keep this in mind forever. But like, if that's not your work, if your work is making art, then make it with care in mind, I think.
We need art right now. Jen, what you just said reminds me of the Australian author reading literary community, you know, in January and February launched Authors for Fireys. You know, the writing community in Australia is not paid well and has terrible working conditions or are freelancers, and yet came together in that time of crisis in a way to significantly help other essential workers. You know, the 5 people at the front of that crisis, that ongoing crisis. I'm really enjoying talking to you about your work, Jen, and I'm interested in how you're looking after yourself, particularly how you're choosing to engage in the art or the writing of other creatives at this time. You know, how do you find solace or engage, you know, in the happy parts of the world?
Yeah, look, I think in terms of the work that I'm embracing, I think I've been reading a lot of plague-related books.
Have you? I love that too, and people tell me it's a strange thing to do at this time. What have you been reading?
No, I made a list at the very beginning, and I've been working my way through it. I haven't got through all of it, but you know, Camus on there, Defoe, and a couple of new books that I really loved, like Laura Jean McKay's The Animals in That Country, which is just amazing. You would love it. It's really fun. And Meg Mundel's The Trespassers as well, which was a really interesting plague novel. So there's some really good contemporary Australian fiction out there as well. But I have also been interspersing this with like comfort reading YA fantasy novels and the Inspector Montalbano books, which I started at the beginning of this year. I think I'm up to like the 10th one now.
Excellent. I also really enjoyed Meg Mundel's The Trespassers. Absolutely fantastic book, and well timed, given that we are living in a pandemic. Do you find yourself, I don't know, like engaging, like, you know, going into film or music, or is it always reading for you?
Music's been good, like familiar music's been good, and definitely film and Netflix and stuff. But I think it's different when it's reading, because reading is private. It's my own private brain experience, and I think that's a little more of an escape. The thing that I think I've struggled with is actually um, what I do in the times when I'm not reading and not consuming entertainment and not working. I think that's been like the empty times is when it's frightening. And I think anyone who's been through any kind of grief will understand what that feels like. You have those moments of silence where it creeps up on you and you find a way to get busy again. So in that, what I've been doing in that time is a lot of really labor intensive cooking, um, which, you know,
Always a good choice.
Italy is great for that. Pasta making and gnocchi and, you know, elaborate food experiments. And, you know, it's a way of expressing care as well for my partner, but it's also just, it's really good distraction.
Look, making fantastic pasta in Italy is not a bad thing. We have a question from the audience, which I'm going to read to you, Jen. During the pandemic, we have looked to art for comfort. Can traditional written forms address the world in crisis, or do our ways of telling stories need to adapt?
I think our ways of telling stories are adapting already. And, you know, in some ways, both of these roles are really important. The solace of fiction is really important, but also the challenge of fiction and its ability to open up new ways of thinking and new ways of reflecting. You know, fiction builds your oral universe, it builds your character, and we absolutely need that to be bigger right now and stronger. But also that feeling of solace does matter. I don't think it's either or. I think we need to do both. And some people are good at one side of it and some people are good at the other side of it. I think I'm not very good at the solace part.
That's what art is for, to fill those times. I have another question from the audience for you. How can writers get into an immersive creative headspace during a crisis? What motivates that?
I think it's really difficult to get into that feeling of flow, or like the zone of creativity. For me, I've been working in much shorter snatches. Definitely like white noise and having a little cave-ish sort of a space in the corridor has helped. But I also think just giving yourself a break is really important, because it's quite difficult to work in this situation. There's a lot of ambient grief and stress. There's a lot of extra work of care and adaptation. And I think like it's really important to not set yourself really unrealistic goals of things that like, oh, I'm going to use this time to like read Proust and write my masterpiece. Like, no, honey, you're not. Just like celebrate the fact that you wrote a paragraph today, like, and give yourself those rewards and rest and care. And, you know, I think people with chronic illnesses and disabilities are really useful in this time, because they also already have a lot of these skills about how to manage that time and exhaustion, and set goals and integrate that care work into their daily practice. And the rest of us need to catch the fuck up.
Absolutely. Another question for you. They're coming through thick and fast. As a writing mentor, and I assume that's because you are part of the Kill Your Darlings mentoring program this year.
Yes, apply now.
What advice do you have for emerging writers at this time? And is the advice any different after what you are experiencing now during the pandemic?
Well, I think with emerging writers, there's often this sort of stress about one's personal career goals and networking, and getting your work out there, the kind of thing. And a lot of the networking opportunities have just disappeared because there's no public events, there's no writers' festivals, so you can't sort of go along to things and meet people. But my advice is generally focus on the work anyway, so I guess that's part of it. Yeah, look, I think there's opportunities to sort of collaborate with other people at this point and to look after each other through sort of, online means, starting book clubs and writing clubs and reading to each other and reading groups, and all of these things are really a big part of it, and I think it's a good opportunity to sort of develop your literary citizenship and look at sort of what you can offer the world, I think.
You are so good with words, Jen. Literary citizenship is a fantastic phrase and way of looking at it. We do have one more question. As an avid fan, I love your sense of humor in your writing. What curious things have made you smile or chuckle during the week?
Well, the biggest smile on my face this week was seeing the palpable relief on the faces of parents with young children in the park in the last couple of days, and have been finally allowed out. And I'm not sure who was bouncing higher, the toddlers or the dogs. In the park's really weedy, and you can just see these like little dogs leaping along. That's really delightful. And also just trying to like interpret the things that Italians are doing from their balconies is really interesting and hilarious. Because, not being sort of embedded in the culture, it seems like there's always sort of some commemoration or some memorial is happening, and I don't know exactly what it is, but I'm like, yay, okay, we're all singing now.
You can participate too. And that actually leads us straight into the next question that we received. Has the romantic disposition of the Italians and their language changed you and your writing in any way?
The romantic disposition. I think it's too early to say. I think learning the language is really, really interesting. And it's giving me a lot more insight into English as well because of the Latin crossover. And, I feel like I'm learning about Italy through the language more than anything at the moment because I'm hardly interacting with any Italians. The goodwill and public spiritedness here has been really inspiring to me and surprising. I think I had a stereotype of Italians as quite anarchic, and that's not true at all here. The vast majority of people have been really sensible and caring and kind and obedient. And that's been really interesting to sort of check myself and my preconceptions.
Absolutely. Jen, thank you so much for getting up early and speaking to us today. It has, I've been looking forward to chatting with you and I don't know, learning about how you see the world and this crappy year that we are all experiencing. And I love your fiction. And because I'm a fan, I would just like everybody to read Dyschronia, for which you were shortlisted for the Miles Franklin last year, because honestly, it is a beautiful, beautiful book. Jen, thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Astrid. It's been really lovely to chat.
Bye, everyone.